Welcome back. We're starting a new unit today. We're going to look at marketing channels, which concretely means we're going to look at supply chains and look about upstream, meaning how suppliers, and also downstream, retailers and wholesalers interact with the firm's marketing approach. Now, we're going to use the word marketing channels, just meaning that there are different ways that a company is interacting with the customers, and also how the marketing interacts with the intermediaries, as I said, either suppliers or retailers and wholesalers, and how those things can be part of a larger marketing strategy. So today we're going to be mostly looking at kind of some of the basics of that, and we're going to go. So it's going to cover some topics like organizing of franchises, companies that produce a product but then work with different distributors, and some of the issues that come up with that. So let's start with our roadmap for today. So the first thing is what are marketing channels? And the word channel is just kind of a way that the customer is being approached, and that there are more different ways. There are direct channels, which means that there's no intermediary between the company and the customer, and there can be, let's say, indirect channels where you're going through a distributor, or you're going through a distributor, or you're going through a retailer or wholesaler, and there's kind of, let's say, different ways for the product to get into to the customer. Now, I think these things have become particularly, not so much the marketing aspect, but people have become much more aware of supply chains because of the interruption of supply chains due to the current pandemic, which means how food gets to actual customers has become more visible, and something that was kind of, let's say, behind the scenes and not really understood except for people that were dealing with it directly, but also about how people are buying things. People are not going to stores as much anymore. People are buying things through online retailers, and that's kind of suggesting a different way that the value chain and how things are supplied, and even from like where people are buying food, that people are increasingly buying food through local markets like farmers markets, online distributors, and not so much at grocery stores as they would have in the past. So what we're going to look at, kind of when we go deeper into this, is that how do these upstream, meaning suppliers, and downstream pieces of the supply chain affect marketing? So we see companies that are very keen on looking at where they're sourcing like their products. So for example, that you have things like fair price coffee to make sure that the coffee that people are drinking is not used with exploitative labor. You can see things like dolphin-friendly tuna, and kind of suggesting that where the is coming from is harvested in an environmentally friendly and sustainable way. You see things about the purity of food. You see people who want to get food that is grown in the local area so that they're using less, let's say, fossil fuels to transport it to market. And so there's a variety of different ways that how upstream things are affecting that. Something we have also know about is downstream, which means where are we going to place it? And we've seen this, we've kind of mentioned this briefly when we talked about Pepsi. We have Pepsi, which is the company that owns the brand and, let's say, the formula and things like that, and the merchandising, the advertising. But there's also something called Pepsi Bottling Group, PBG, which is involved for most of its distribution, which is a separate company. We can see distribution, particularly recently with the pandemic, where food distribution has gone through grocery stores, but there's a separate distribution chain that goes through restaurants and institutional things like schools or hospitals or things of that sort. And those things have been, since they're not the same, there have been some supply issues getting from, let's say, the farm to the table. And lastly, we're going to talk about how does the supply chain interact to create or destroy value. So some of these things are about making sure that people that where you're getting or sourcing your materials, your inputs into your process is important because of the purity, or because of the quality, or because they want to know that it's made in a certain country, or things that are downstream, sort of how it's actually getting into their hands. Now, there's another part to this which is about creating and destroying value, which means if you have a variety of different marketing channels, more is not always more, meaning that you're getting different ways to access the customer. You can have problems where different marketing channels are undercutting each other. So, for example, if you are a tire manufacturer and you have Michelin or Firestone or Bridgestone, like a name brand that sells an exclusive tire, is also the manufacturer of that tire. When you make that available in, let's say, retail markets like at a big box store like Lowe's or Walmart or something else like that, it can undercut your exclusive dealerships. Same thing with cars, which means that if you can buy all different brands of cars and they don't have to be associated with a particular manufacturer, that changes the relationship. Another way that you historically is movie theaters and movie studios. It used to be that not only did MGM and Universal and Warner make the movies, but they also owned different studios or owned monopolies of different studios in different parts of the country. So that kind of affected what kinds of movies they were making because MGM had a monopoly on the southern movie theaters, while Warner had kind of a monopoly on the Northeast and large cities. And this kind of affected where Warner focused on disaster movies and gangster movies, and MGM focused on musicals and things that focused on the South. These things can actually affect, like, people comes into calculation about how they're going to market their product. So supply chains are part of a value delivery network, which means that everything that, in a sense, connects the production of the creation of the product and till it gets into the customer's hand is something about creating a value chain, and that if there are, let's say, weaknesses in the supply chain, these can affect, let's say, the amount of value, the customer's value, and therefore impede your ability to capture that value through a marketing strategy. So I've used some of these terms already about upstream and downstream. Upstream is about anything that's supplying you raw materials, parts, goods, anything that's kind of going into your product. So this can be, farms for food. It could be, let's say, where your petroleum products, so whether oil is coming from domestic sources or foreign sources. It could be for something about where what type of labor went into it. So many people object, particularly with fashion lines, about exploitative labor practices or child labor practices that go into that. So these are things that might be upstream that might be of a concern, but also kind of, let's say, with food, with genetically modified products, or with pesticides being used on different foods, or whether it's organic or non-organic. We see that upstream concerns have become more and more important than they might have been in the past. And then you have downstream, which means these are marketing channel partners that link you to the customer. So these are retailers like a Walmart or a Kohl's or a Target. These could be wholesalers. So for example, very often when you have grocery stores, they don't sell directly to the grocery store. You sell to a food distributor or a food wholesaler who then has a variety of different, let's say, customers, and they distribute things like beverages or baked goods or things of that sort. So one just example of this that I've run into recently, so for like bread and starches, we usually go to a bakery outlet that is, it produces a variety of different products. So this is one in New Paltz, New York, and it makes Thomas English muffins and Arnold moldy grain breads and a variety of different bagels and Entenmann's and Freihofer's donuts and a lot of different types of chips. And so what they do is that even though these are national brands, what happens is different local bakeries contract to make these products, and then they distribute them to, let's say, individual grocery stores and delis and things of that sort. So there's a lot of different parts to this, so that you have let's say, the name brand of, let's say, Entenmann's chocolate frosted donuts, or you have Arnold bread or Thomas English muffins, which can be found all around the country. But they're made in local bakeries that are not necessarily branded in such a way, and then those local bakeries are then going to go through an outlet and distribute them to make the deliveries to grocery stores. So these are all examples of downstream marketing channels where they would have an interest in, let's say, every step of this way, because if you have a local bakery that is not up to standard, then you might not want to include them because they're going to give your overall brand a bad name, or they're not going to deliver enough supply to various retailers and grocery stores and things of that sort. Another good example of this is Girl Scout cookies. Girl Scout cookies have some, very well recognized brands. They're sold all around the country, but the actual Girl Scout cookies are actually baked locally. And so with the Girl Scouts and their organization about the cookies kind of contacts local bakeries and makes sure that they're producing them to a uniform standard that people expect who have had Girl Scout cookies in all different parts of the country. So a value delivery network, this is kind of similar to what a supply chain is, but what we're thinking about the supply chain is that what the supply chain is doing is delivering value to the customer. So the value delivery network is the network made up of the company itself, suppliers, the upstream partners, distributors, meaning downstream partners, and including, and if you want to think about it, the customers themselves who are partners to improve, let's say, the value that's being produced and performance of the entire system, and so that the end customer is getting the maximum value that they expect. So what we call these are marketing channels, and channels you can think of as ways that the flow of the product from the upstream, let's say suppliers of raw materials and inputs and things of that sort, to the company, to all the different ways it can go through wholesalers and retailers to come to the customer. So there are ways of, let's say, that you can approach the customer. So when we think of channels like channels on a TV, these are different, let's say, streams by which we can access them. So for example, a marketing channel could be online sales, a marketing channel could be a wholesaler or distributor, a marketing channel could be a store that's owned by the manufacturer or an outlet. A marketing channel could be, let's say, a catalog service where you are, you have a catalog and people ordering directly from the company. These are all different channels, or it can be just a direct relationship with the retailer. So the point about it is that we can think of many different ways of getting a product between the company itself that's making the product and the customer who is ultimately purchasing it. So the marketing channels are these interdependent organizations that make the product or service available for consumption. So what I was saying is these are different pathways by which, let's say, the customer is able to access it or to get to the company's product. So here's a kind of a graphic description of like some possible, let's say, marketing channels. So what you could have here is you could have a series of different manufacturers. Let's say each manufacturer has its own relationship with each customer. So there are 3 manufacturers and 3 customers, 3 times 3. There's going to be 9 contacts without any type of distributor. So imagine if the manufacturers directly, let's say, sold things to customers. So if you had to, when you're buying, let's say, a soft drink beverage, or if you're buying white bread, or you're buying bagels or pasta or soup, and you actually had to go directly to the company to make your order, there would be lots of different contacts, which means this would be inefficient from the company's perspective, but also probably inefficient from the customer's perspective, because they would have to kind of look, the customer would have to go find 3 different manufacturers, compare their offerings, make an order, get the order delivered, etc. And same thing with the manufacturer, they would have to find all their different customers, and there would be a lot more contacts. Now imagine a kind of a simpler system, and this is kind of generally how it occurs, is that you might have a series of manufacturers and they all go to one distributor. So this generally might be a wholesaler, this might be a distributor who specializes in products and make sure that they get to the individual retailers that then maybe are getting to the end customers. And so instead of having 9 different contacts, you can reduce that to 6. This makes a much more efficient distribution through the market channels. What is mostly happening, with the use of intermediaries, which means wholesalers, retailers, distributors, is that you're getting greater efficiency. Because as a manufacturer, you might know your customer in a general sense, but you might not know your customer in a particular sense or in a local sense. And what retailers often know is they know their customers better because they're having daily interactions with their customer, while maybe a manufacturer of a product is not. So for example, if you're something like Best Buy and you're seeing people and seeing how they're looking at different offerings on their show floor, they have a better insight into what the customer is wanting, and therefore can communicate that back to manufacturers of flat screen TVs or other electronics devices and things of that sort. And what these intermediaries result is a greater efficiency in the sense that making the goods that customers actually want available in the markets where people want them, as opposed in a sense just making a product, putting it out there, and assuming that the anonymous market is going to make these connections. When we talked about, before we talked about supply and demand, we talked about the search model called search equilibrium. And the search equilibrium, this is sort of what we talked about, the disco model. That a big part of making, let's say, the market work is kind of this search of, let's say, sellers and buyers. And that can involve time, that can involve resources. And what these intermediaries do is that they do it more efficiently by trying to make these linkages up. Now, there's still a cost to that because obviously the intermediaries have to be paid in some way, but this is going to be a lot more efficient for society because they're not having to make, every single buyer is not having to make that search, and every single seller is not having to engage in that search. They can kind of unload that onto an intermediary to make that, to broker that connection. So these channel members add value because they have contacts, which means they might have leads, they have experience, they might be specialized in a particular type of product, and they might be specialized in a particular area, and they might have a scale of operation. So let me just go back to talking about one of my favorite examples, which is soft drink companies, is that Coca-Cola basically controlled its entire process, which meant that they were not only the owner and the manufacturer of Coca-Cola, they were also the distributor. And they did not want to, let's say, have other people involved in the process, and this reflected Coca-Cola's kind of corporate culture that they wanted to have control. While Pepsi was much more open about allowing local distributors, that Pepsi made the product, but then distributors actually brought it to market. So in Coca-Cola, this is one company, while Pepsi really is two companies. You have PepsiCo, and then you have PBG, Pepsi Bottling Group, which handles a lot of the distribution. And what that allowed Pepsi to do is to find a lot of different markets and to find different ways. So while Coca-Cola was only being distributed in what you might call fountain soda, the reason why people who drank Coca-Cola traditionally call it soda, while Pepsi was kind of made the innovation that they were going to sell soft drinks in a bottle, hence pop, because when Pepsi was sold, it had a bottle cap, and when you took it off, it made a pop sound, and that's why certain regions of the country refer to it as pop. Pepsi was able to innovate how to get it to market and how to get it to customers in ways that Coca-Cola didn't, because they were selling exclusively to what you might call soda fountains. So what these channels do is they complete the transaction, which, as I was saying, is this search equilibrium. They are gathering information, they are promoting your product out there, they're making contact with end retailers, and they're matching buyers and sellers in the market, and they're also carrying out these negotiations. So if there's any difference or haggling on price, they're doing it at a remove from the manufacturer and from the actual product. So the point is that they are actually, in a sense, doing this search and making these transactions occur, which are not going to happen naturally. And lastly, they're also, in a sense, fulfilling the transactions, which means they are getting the product from the factory to the warehouse to the retailer. They sometimes will involve in financing and take some of the risk. And so one good example of financing and risk taking is the relationship between auto manufacturers and auto dealers. So what auto manufacturers, they make the cars, but what they do through their transaction is that very often is that auto dealers will arrange financing, and they make most of their money not on the profit they make off selling the cars, but on the interest they make by arranging the financing. Now, risk taking can also be shared through the network, because what you see in a lot of different types of stores, auto dealers and magazines would be another good example of this, is like if you don't sell your product, who's going to be stuck with the loss? So very often with magazines, what happens if a distributor does not sell a magazine, the publisher will buy back the unsold copies. And what you'll see sometimes in retail stores is what they'll do is they'll rip off the front cover of a magazine to basically make it unsaleable and then return it. And therefore they're not charged for the magazines they did not sell. This is why often you see a lot of, let's say, convenience stores and bookstores have a whole series of magazines that don't seem to sell, because they're willing to put them out there because it's costless for them, because they're not actually purchasing that inventory. The issues they don't sell are returned to the publisher, and the publisher will eat the loss. And that's kind of a way of getting to the actual reader from the publisher, and but the point is that the risk of the transaction is shared through the market. So we can think of a variety of different, let's say, marketing and business channels. So here on the left, what you see is ones where you have producer-consumer. This is the simplest one. This is where the producer kind of finds its consumer. You might see this as direct sales. And you can see this for a lot of specialized products. So like if you were in agriculture and you were a farmer, you were probably buying a tractor or some of your farm equipment directly from the company, because you're not going to make a lot of purchases, and there's not a lot of sellers. And so the point is that you might look through a catalog and you might find the particular equipment you're looking for. And that's very often when you have specialized consumers who are going to do the research and know what they're looking for and are going to be able to link up with the producer. More typically is that you might see producer to retailer to consumer. So you have a manufacturer, they sell to a retailer such as Walmart or Target or Kohl's, and then the retailer sells it to the consumer. You know, more, but probably more typically, but particularly in the food supply chain, you have a producer. You have a variety of different, let's say, farmers, agricultural, and generally you sell to a wholesaler. And generally, wholesalers have to have licenses because, particularly for meat, dairy, and produce, there's a license you get from the federal government that basically says, look, you're going to get this to market, and you're going to have two things. One, to make sure the food is safe, which means that it's going to be properly refrigerated and maintained in the supply chain. So the point is, if anything happens between the farm and the market, you know, they have a reputation for making sure that the food is not tainted in the process and properly handled. But the other thing is that very often farmers are trying to sell, but they don't know they're selling on credit, which means that someone's purchasing, let's say, their entire crop, but they're not like putting cash on the table. And so what this license basically indicates, it gives something called an agricultural blue book that lists reputable wholesalers. And so those are people that they're more likely to sell to. And this is becoming, with some of the supply chain issues on food, particularly during the pandemic, you're seeing is a lot of people are trying to make money off this, but they don't have experience. And what they're finding is that farmers are not willing to sell to them because they don't have a reputation and they're not licensed. And therefore, what's happening is that there's kind of a breakdown between the producer and the retailer, then ultimately the customer. So more typically, though, is that, you know, your producer to a wholesaler. The wholesaler will sell to a variety of different retailers. You see this particularly in grocery stores where, you know, you're buying lettuce, you're buying, you know, beets, you're buying arugula, zucchini, whatever. Is that there's probably someone out there that just buys zucchini from all the different farmers and producers of zucchini, and then they find a variety of different grocery stores who all want zucchini but are not, let's say, specialized in that. And then they're distributing to the retailers, and obviously the retailers will get it to the customer. In terms of business marketing, you're going to see a lot more kind of specialized marketing channels because there might not be as many buyers. There might be more specialized buyers. There might be a lot more repeat purchases, and we talked about this before when we talked about consumer and business buying behavior, is that the way you might market to them is more about reliability and less about, let's say, having a promotion or a gimmick or a sale, because you're dealing with kind of, let's say, captured customers and captured producers who are kind of dedicated to selling and buying and selling from each other in a way that a consumer would not. So one way to look at these channels is to look at the number of channel levels, which means how many intermediaries are there between the end producer and the end customer. And so you can have direct marketing channels where there's no intermediary, which means that customers are buying directly from the producers. So for example, if you have what's called a CSA, you might actually go to, or a farmer's market, there might be a market right outside on the farm road, and you just go past and they have a stand and you buy things directly. More typically what happens is that you have indirect marketing channels, which means there's some type of wholesaler that buys most of the crop and then distributes it to grocery stores who then sells it to end consumers. And you can have a variety of different flows, and the way you're going to organize this is depending on the efficiency of the transactions, which means you need sometimes specialized knowledge about who has a demand for different goods. Sometimes you need someone who is able to put people together. People have limited time because they're either, you know, doing other things. We don't have an infinite amount of time to shop, and we also don't have an infinite amount of time if we're producing something to go find our customers. And therefore, we might have more and more indirect marketing channels if the cost of transactions are high, or the cost of searching to make that connection between buyers and sellers would be prohibitively costly. So the channel is generally will be most effective when each link in the supply chain has a particular task and is specialized in doing what it can do best, which means if producers are focusing mostly on production, if consumers are mostly focused on going to retailers, so people might have more specialty about transportation, physical distribution of the good or product. There might be some people who are better at the marketing, which means the advertising part of it. There might be other people who are more specialized in terms of how to place it effectively on store shelves and things of that sort. Um, and a lot of this has to do with there has to be some. So the point is that a lot of different tasks, but people understand not just what their job is, but how their job or their task fits in within the overall kind of goal of getting the product to the market and the overall channel goals. But you can have, very different conflict. You can have horizontal conflict, which means that, let's say you have two retailers who are trying to sell the same product, but in different ways, which means they might be cannibalizing each other's sales. So this can happen, for example, if you are a restaurant chain. So, for example, Little Sorrento's and Savannah's are owned by the same ownership. If people go to one restaurant, they're obviously not necessarily going to buy at the other restaurant, and so there can be some type of conflict between people on the same level of the marketing channel. There can also be vertical conflict, which means that wholesalers and retailers might be not cooperating because wholesalers have an interest in moving their product, and they don't really care who's selling it, while retailers want to have a reliable supply chain to make sure that when they need something, that it can be delivered on demand. You saw this a little bit in terms of medical supplies and particularly with personal protective equipment, because what happened with the privatization of most hospital chains is that they weren't storing a lot of equipment on site at the hospitals, and they had what was called a just-in-time, inventory management system, which means that they basically were efficient. They only bought what they needed or what they were going to use on a particular day, which means they know what their average use of masks or their average use of hospital gowns, latex, nitrile gloves, and things of that sort. And so they weren't stockpiling a lot of the things that they ultimately they were going to need in the pandemic because they were relying on their supply chain to make daily deliveries and have what they needed, and they have that replenished every day, and they didn't have capacity in the hospitals. And part of this is because what happened in a lot of hospitals is areas of the hospitals that would have been used as like storerooms, and having backups and extra gear and equipment and things of that sort were converted into rooms for caring for patients or for doing surgeries or doing procedures, because that's how the hospital was making money. And they reduced the amount of, let's say, what they were using for storage, which was not producing any revenue. However, what happened during the pandemic is that obviously the demand, these supply chains broke down, and there's a lot of conflict between trying to source who was being able to produce or get to the actual hospital the personal protective equipment that the first responders and frontline workers needed. So sometimes conflict can be healthy in the sense that if you have more than one provider in the market, you can bounce them off each other and getting them to reduce their price. But it can lead to conflict when you might have no suppliers upstream, or suppliers, or in a sense retailers, if they all get fed up with you. So one example of conflict would be Goodyear's decision in the early 1990s to start selling its tires through big box retail, particularly Sam's and Walmart. And Sears. And the reason why it created conflict was that Goodyear had their own stores. And what happened is when you were a Goodyear reseller and you were connecting and you had the Goodyear slogan, and remember that's advertising for Goodyear, and you were thinking that you had a special relationship because you were the one source for these tires that had a certain reputation. If people could buy them cheaper in, let's say, a big box store or Walmart or things like that, Sears, there was no reason to go to their independent dealers and distribution network. You also saw this a lot with Best Buy and a lot of big box retail with the advent of online buying, is that people were going into Best Buy to, in a sense, use it as a showroom to look at things like flat screen TVs and various other digital electronic equipment, and then they would try it out at Best Buy, but instead of buying it from Best Buy, what they would do is go onto Amazon or to some other online retail site, and they were buying it online, which means that the big box retailers were not, were getting cut out of, let's say, the loop. And you see this sometimes with some retailers that have an online presence as well, which means you can buy something online or you can buy something in the store. And if people can buy things online, then there's not going to be a lot of foot traffic to the store, and the type of customer you're going to get is going to change. And this can change the dynamics of the different marketing channels. So We can think of two different kind of distribution channels. One is a conventional marketing channel, which we kind of described before. You have producer manufacturer who sells to a wholesaler, who then, in a sense, is a supply for a variety of different retailers, and then the retailer handles the end sale to the consumer. Now, there are some situations where the producer, the wholesaler, and retailer are actually all linked together in one chain, which means that one might own, like a producer might own the wholesaler and the retailer, and even though they might be separate steps and they might have different names, they're kind of, in a sense, vertically integrated. So you can see this with gasoline, where something like ExxonMobil not only does the extraction of oil and the refinement of gasoline, they also have they own a lot of gas stations, although some of them are franchised. You can see this in terms of, I mentioned with Pepsi, which is that they don't just, at one time they were buying, fast food chains because they were kind of locked out of Burger King and McDonald's. And to get their product to consumers, they had to own the restaurant and then have exclusive distribution rights. You can see this in terms of things like the Apple Store, where Apple products are not just sold in a department store or an electronics store. They're sold in stores where there's an exclusive, let's say, Apple, focus on Apple products that also excludes all its competitors. So you can see this where there's a connection between producers, wholesalers, and retailers, and they're just different, let's say, divisions of one large company, or where one owns, where the national company also owns many of the local franchises as well. So in a conventional distribution channel, as I said, you have a variety of different separate businesses, and they're all trying to maximize their own profits, and they're at the expense of the profits of the system as a whole, which means that if I'm a wholesaler and I can make money by buying cheaply from my producer and then selling at a higher price to my retailers, that's good for me, even though it's not necessarily good for my partners, because I'm making a larger profit, but then the producers who are not getting paid as much are not making a profit, and then the retailers, because they have to buy things at a higher price, are going out of business. But if you keep that model, even though you might be profitable in the short term, if you put your partners out of business, you're going to collapse the entire value chain. A good example of this, where there's a lot of harmony between the different parts in the distribution channel, would be Toyota, because what would happen with Toyota is that they would hire, when things were slack, they would hire employees from some of their suppliers, particularly their spare parts and things of that sort. And they also had a relationship that when they were slack, that their suppliers and their retailers and distributors would hire some of their employees. And this had a way of kind of, let's say, sharing the burden or load sharing that, allowed everyone to value each other and to not take advantage of each other. Now, you could have, let's say, a very formal relationship, meaning a legal relationship in a vertical marketing system, where the producer, wholesaler, retailers are one system, and one of them might own another one, or they might have long-term contracts or exclusive contracts to distribute them. So I mentioned a few of these, like where historically most movie studios also had large chains. In fact, most movie studios were created from chains of theaters, and the chains of theaters needed content, and so then they bankrolled and created the original Hollywood movie studios. And you're sort of seeing the same thing happen now with some of the online streaming services, that when they first started, they were just, in a sense, distributing other people's content, which means they weren't really in the business of making any content. But you've seen in the last 4 or 5 years that Netflix and Amazon have won Academy Awards, have gotten by producing their own content. And there's an exclusivity to that, and there you see kind of more of an integration where the producers and the retailers are working in lockstep with each other. So some types of vertical marketing systems, as I said, you can have single ownership. You could have contracts, meaning you have franchises. So variety, most, let's say, national brands like Dunkin' Donuts or Subway or McDonald's or Burger King are mostly on the franchise model, which means that the local stores, and you can tell this usually because they say participating stores, that means that franchisees have a choice whether to participate in a nationwide marketing campaign or not. are owned by individual entrepreneurs. They're not owned by the larger company. What happens is they sign a contract, which means they have to buy their raw material, they have to buy their goods from the company, they have to, in a sense, be consistent in their marketing campaign, they might have to adhere to certain standards. On the other hand, they might get some support, meaning they might get some help with financing from the national company. And different franchises cost different amounts. And one reason why, particularly Subway, expanded so quickly compared to other fast food restaurants is that the franchising fee for Subway was significantly lower than it was for other types of restaurants. And so if you were a new entrepreneur, it was a lot easier to start by owning a Subway franchise than it would be to own, you know, maybe perhaps a different type of restaurant or fast food chain. So another one, Zara, which is a fashion brand, it basically controls the entire marketing channel distribution system because they're not only the producers, but they also have kind of exclusive distribution. And so they can go from having a new fashion, new design, produce it, and have it in their stores in a relatively short amount of time. And here it says less than 1 month, as opposed to, let's say, something like the Gap or something like Forever 21 that might, or Marshalls or TJ Maxx. They have to source their inventory, they have to source their product, and it might take a much longer time for them to get from a fashion line to a product in their. So franchises are much more common. And basically, as I was saying before, franchise operations are they're sponsored retailers for the franchise. They can be sponsored wholesalers for the franchise, or they can be a service firm sponsored by which means is that you might have a service, like for example, Geek Squad is a service part of, it's an independent company, but it's basically working as a service, working in lockstep with Best Buy. So almost anything can be franchised. Usually you think of contractors and handyman as being the perfect example of an individual proprietary business, but Mr. Handyman can also be a brand, which means you can have Mr. Handyman handling the advertising and handling the national brand that has some type of recognition to it, and therefore then even individual contractors can work under that brand. Another one is Roto-Rooter Plumbers, which I thought was a large company, but it turns out that it was just kind of a franchise system where individual plumbers could work under the Roto-Rooter, the aegis of their company and profit from, let's say, their brand recognition. So one example of something that does not franchise, and this I think is kind of surprising, is that all Starbucks stores are actually owned by the corporate national company. Unlike McDonald's, unlike Burger King, unlike most other recognizable chains, is that they don't have franchises and they don't plan to franchise. That means every single Starbucks is owned by Starbucks. The only times where they have some type of cooperation is when they need access, which means if they're in a mall or they're in specialized locations. So for example, there's a Starbucks on West Point, or if they're in an airport or something like that, they might do that to have access to locations, but they have not, in a sense, franchised. And this is kind of a deliberate decision by Starbucks, and I think partially because Starbucks is a very recognizable brand, and unlike Dunkin' Donuts, one of its main competitors, is that there's not as much a variation from store to store. And I think that keeping that brand identity has been very core to what Starbucks has been doing in the last few years. And if you look at Dunkin' Donuts, even if you look at, let's say, the donuts produced, there's a lot of Dunkin' Donuts franchises in the area. But if you order like the same donut at different Dunkin' Donuts, you'll get something slightly different because the bakery that's producing the donuts for different franchises are not exactly the same. And I know this because I have a particular thing that I like to order. And whether I go to Yorktown Heights or Shrub Oak or Peekskill, it'll be quite a different piece of merchandise. So some other kind of horizontal systems is when two companies that have very distinct identities kind of go into a marketing opportunity. So the Walmart near where I live in Newburgh has a McDonald's inside the Walmart, so Walmart is a recognizable brand, McDonald's is a recognizable brand, even though they're selling kind of similar products. But a large Walmart's, not so much the one in Cortland Town Center, but a lot of Walmarts also function as grocery stores. And you might think that McDonald's is cannibalizing some of their business, but they might see that there's kind of it's a good way for McDonald's to locate new chains without having to have, let's say, the problem of, let's say, building its own store and refurbishing it, and being your own landlord and things of that sort that can make things more complicated, particularly as things change around. You know that a Walmart is going to have a lot of walk-through traffic, and to have, let's say, a restaurant in store. You also see this with, like, sometimes you see Blimpies or different types of sub shops built into the Walmart, and it's been kind of an effective model. So what you can also have is multi-channel distribution, meaning that you don't have to commit to one way or another. Now, as I said before, there are times where these different channels can compete with each other, but you might think that you might want to have kind of a distribution that intensive distribution everywhere. So you might have direct, so going direct. You might have segment your consumers and customers into different segments and have different marketing channels for different ones. So you might have a consumer segment that is very expert and knows what it's looking for, and then you can access them through catalogs or online platforms or telephone sales and things of that sort. You might have another business segment where they are making purchases, large repeat purchases, and you might have, let's say, a marketing rep or a sales rep who's maintaining a variety of different accounts. You could have, as I said, producer to retailer to consumer, or you can have kind of the intermediary, some type of distributor or wholesaler that then sells to a dealer or to a retailer, and then eventually to the end buyer. So these multi-channel distribution systems is you might sometimes it's because you're basically segmenting the customers in different groups, and you're trying to market to them in the way that it's going to be the best way to access them, and you're kind of, in a sense, keeping the way you're selling to each of them kind of hidden from the other ones, because you might not be aware, like how, like, you buy Coca-Cola or Pepsi in a grocery store, but you might see there's a different marketing channel when it's being sold into a restaurant or being sold to a fast food chain. And so you can have these hybrid marketing channels. And the advantages is that you have different types of customers with different types of needs, which means if you are a restaurant, you need a constant supply. If you're selling in a grocery store and a consumer, you might have more of, let's say, like sales, like, for example, beverages might go on sale before Super Bowl Sunday, and therefore there's going to be a high demand for that. And you might have promotions that are tied into that, which would not be necessary for selling to restaurants or to repeat buyers. However, multi-channel distribution can create some problems. John Deere riding mowers. John Deere has its own businesses, its own dealerships. And what happened is that Lowe's started selling John Deere, and this became a problem for John Deere dealers because they had a brand recognition, it was identifiable, and being by the only place where you could get this particular brand of product, drove a lot of their business. And if they could get that anywhere in a Lowe's, it basically makes it harder for people to go to local dealers. You often see this with, probably the best example of this was Sears, when Sears had its own brand. So even as Sears was a declining retailer, they owned a lot of the appliance brands, Amana, Kenmore. They also had their own very well-regarded line of tools, Craftsman, which were only sold in Sears stores, and so people would go in for those things, and then they would make other purchases while in the Sears. And what happened with Sears is basically they were forced to, as a retail business declined, to sell off their brand. So now Craftsman tools, which used to only be available in Sears, are now sold at Lowe's and also in other locations. And therefore, this, even though there are more channels approaching the consumers, what this did is that this created tension and conflict within their distribution network. What you can do is you can try to change your channel organization, which means that as customers and consumers change, you might want different ways to approach them. And the most obvious one here is that people buy less and less in big box stores and more online. And one of the biggest things is that some brick and mortar retailers move quickly to online platforms much earlier than other ones. A good example of something that did not move to an online platform was Radio Shack, which means you would think Radio Shack would be an innovator because they were in the digital and technology space, but in fact they had one of the worst websites well into that because they were trying to drive everyone to go into their stores because they were relying upon these experts who knew what they wanted and wanted very specific types of things, and how Radio Shack used its shelf space and the types of products it sold. Two things happened. The first one is that it wasn't just, let's say, techie type of people that were buying, let's say, electronic gadgets anymore. It became much more throughout the entire customer population. And while they were only targeting kind of these experts or dedicated buyers who maybe just wanted to buy something quickly and conveniently, and Radio Shack wasn't really addressing them. And they were selling kind of a variety of different, having like unique parts that most people were not using, and they avoided selling some of the things that would have made the biggest sales. And so you want additional channels, but you also don't want your channels to conflict with each other. So you do want innovation, but you also don't want to cannibalize or destroy your traditional business channels. So one last one to think about is on Netflix. And Netflix at this time is that what you've seen is that people don't go to movie theaters as much anymore. And some of this is because of a lot of evolution. People had better home entertainment systems where that the quality of sound and the size of the screen was pretty good at home or comparable at home to going to a movie theater. The development of air conditioning in homes as opposed made it not as important for people in the summer to go to well air conditioned movie theaters. And Netflix gave people the choice that if you didn't like what you were watching, you weren't it wasn't like you were out the cost of a ticket. You could have switched to some other content. And what's happened with Netflix is that Netflix has not just become a retailer, or let's say the way the distributor of content to customers, is now become, let's say, a producer of its own content, and you have exclusive series that are Netflix produced and Netflix financed and distributed over Netflix, and a lot less about buying content from other manufacturers or producers. So this is where we're going to end today. We're going to come back with part 2, and we'll look at a little more depth on marketing channels, and we're going to look more on the upstream parts of the value creation network.